Picture this. You're a Polish winged hussar sitting on your horse at the top of Kohlenberg Mountain. Below you stretches the largest army you have ever seen. 300,000 Ottoman soldiers have surrounded Vienna like a noose. Their white tents stretch for miles, a sea of canvas and steel, choking the life out of Christian Europe's last fortress. You can see the smoke rising from the breached walls. You can hear the distant thunder of Turkish cannons that have been firing for 2 months straight. Your commander, King Jan Sobieski, turns to you and the 17,000 cavalrymen beside you. He doesn't give a speech about God or glory. He simply points down the mountain and says one word: charge. You're about to participate in the largest cavalry charge in human history. A downhill sprint into hell that will either save Western civilization or end it. This is the Battle of Vienna. The story of how the Ottoman Empire's 500-year expansion into Europe was stopped cold by a Polish king, a desperate city, and the physics of gravity. Before we dive into the blood and mud of September 12, 1683, we need to understand what brought this massive Ottoman war machine to the gates of Vienna in the first place. This wasn't a random raid. This was a calculated attempt at decapitation, strike at the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, designed to shatter Christian Europe once and for all. The architect of this apocalyptic campaign was Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. Kara Mustafa was not a sultan by birth, but he was a sultan in ambition. He had risen through the ranks through a combination of political cunning and ruthless efficiency. He had married into power, wedding the daughter of a previous Grand Vizier, and had survived the vicious court intrigues of the Topkapi, palace where a wrong word could earn you a silk bowstring around your neck. By 1683, he stood at the right hand of Sultan Mehmed IV, and he had a vision that consumed him. He wanted to be the man who conquered Vienna. He wanted his name carved into history next to Mehmed, the conqueror who had taken Constantinople. He wanted to be immortal. But Kara Mustafa's ambition was built on a foundation of imperial overreach. The Ottoman Empire in 1683 was not the unstoppable juggernaut it had been a century earlier. It was overstretched, financially strained, and dealing with internal rebellions. The Janissaries, once the elite shock troops of the Sultan, had become a pampered, corrupt force, more interested in political scheming than actual combat. The Sipahis, the feudal cavalry, were undermanned and undertrained. The empire was showing cracks, but Kara Mustafa believed one grand victory could paper over all of it. If he could take Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, he could dictate terms to all of Europe. The wealth of the city alone would refill the depleted Ottoman treasury. The psychological blow would shatter Christian morale. It was a gamble of epic proportions. The Grand Vizier assembled an army that defied comprehension. The exact numbers are debated by historians, but conservative estimates put the force at around 150,000 combat troops, with an additional 150,000 support personnel, laborers, camp followers, and auxiliaries. This wasn't just an army, it was a moving city. They brought siege cannons so large, they required teams of oxen to haul. They brought engineers who could undermine fortress walls. They brought specialists in siegecraft who had studied the Italian school of fortification. But most terrifyingly, they brought time. Kara Mustafa wasn't planning a quick raid. He was planning to sit outside Vienna until the city starved, surrendered, or was blown to rubble. In March of 1683, this massive force began its march from Constantinople. They moved like a slow tidal wave across the Balkans, through Hungary, absorbing tributary forces along the way. The Crimean Tatars joined with their light cavalry. The Wallachians sent troops. By the time the Ottoman army reached the outskirts of Vienna in July, it was the largest invasion force Europe had seen in centuries. Inside Vienna, the situation was desperate from the start. The city's walls were strong, yes, built in the Italian trace style with angled bastions designed to deflect cannon fire. But walls don't defend themselves. They need men, and Vienna was critically short on defenders. The garrison commander, Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, looked at his forces and realized he had maybe 15,000 soldiers to defend a city against an army 10 times that size. Worse, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I had already fled. He packed up his court and ran to Pasha, leaving Vienna to fend for itself. It was a catastrophic blow to morale. The people watched their emperor abandon them, and they knew what that meant. They were expendable. Von Starhemberg didn't have time to despair. He had a city to prepare for siege. He ordered the immediate expulsion of all non-essential civilians. 30,000 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were forced to leave through the gates before the Ottomans arrived. It was a brutal calculus. Every mouth that didn't need to be fed was one more week the garrison could hold out. Those who remained, around 60,000 souls, were trapped. The gates were sealed. The bridges were destroyed. Vienna became an island of stone, surrounded by a sea of enemies. The Ottoman siege began on July 14th with a bombardment that shook the earth. Mustafa positioned his heaviest cannons, massive bronze monsters that fired stone balls weighing up to 300 pounds, aimed them at the most vulnerable sections of the wall. The cannonade was relentless. Day and night, the guns roared. The walls of Vienna, thick as they were, began to crack. Chunks of masonry fell into the moats. Towers collapsed. But Mustafa's real weapon wasn't the cannons. It was the sappers. Ottoman military engineering in the 17th century was the best in the world. They had perfected the art of siege mining, digging tunnels beneath fortress walls, packing them with gunpowder, and blowing massive breaches. The Vienna garrison could hear them. Underneath the city in the dark, Turkish miners were digging closer every day. Von Starhemberg organized countermining operations. His men dug their own tunnels, trying to intercept the Ottomans before they could place their charges. It became an underground war. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in pitch-black tunnels with knives and pistols, never knowing if the roof would collapse or if the enemy had already planted a bomb. The psychological strain was unbearable. Every creak of timber, every distant rumble could be the warning of an imminent explosion. On the surface, the situation was deteriorating. The Ottoman trenches crept closer to the walls. Their sharpshooters picked off any defender foolish enough to show himself on the ramparts. Disease began to spread through the overcrowded city. Dysentery, typhus, and starvation killed as many as enemy fire. The civilians huddled in their homes, listening to the endless percussion of the siege. Mothers covered their children's ears at night to block out the screams of the wounded. The city was slowly dying, and everyone knew it. Von Starhemberg sent desperate messages out through the siege lines. Riders on fast horses tried to break through the Ottoman patrols to reach the Holy Roman Emperor and the other Christian powers. The message was simple: come now, or Vienna falls. And if Vienna falls, all of Europe falls. But help was far away. The Habsburg Empire was slow to mobilize. The German princes were bickering over who should pay for the relief army. The Pope was sending blessings, but not soldiers. As July turned into August, the defenders began to lose hope. Then, in late August, a miracle arrived in the form of a letter. It was carried by a brave messenger who had slipped through the Ottoman lines in the dead of night. The letter bore the seal of Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland. It said simply, "Hold on, I am coming." Jan Sobieski was not supposed to be the savior of Vienna. He was the king of a relatively small kingdom wedged between two empires, the Ottomans to the south and the Russians to the east. Poland was constantly under threat, constantly having to fight for its survival. But Sobieski was a warrior king in the old mold. He didn't rule from a throne room. He ruled from a saddle. By 1683, he had spent his entire adult life fighting the Ottomans. He had defeated them at Khotin. He had beaten them at Lviv. He understood their tactics, their weaknesses, and their psychology better than any general in Europe. When the call for help came from Vienna, Sobieski didn't hesitate. He knew that if the Ottomans took the city, Poland would be next. This wasn't altruism. It was survival. But convincing the Polish nobility to march was another matter. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth operated on a bizarre system where the king needed approval from the Sejm. the parliament of nobles, to do anything. These nobles were notoriously difficult, constantly squabbling over privileges and refusing to fund campaigns. But Sobieski was a master politician. He painted the relief of Vienna not as charity to the Habsburgs, but as a defensive war for Poland. He reminded them that the Ottomans had raided Polish territory for decades. He invoked the specter of Muslim armies marching through Warsaw. It worked. The Sejm approved the mobilization. Sobieski assembled a force of around 18,000 Polish troops, the core of which was the legendary winged hussars. These were not medieval knights. They were something far more terrifying. The hussar was a heavy cavalryman who wore articulated plate armor, carried a long lance called a copia, and most distinctively, wore a pair of wooden frames on his back from which eagle or ostrich feathers projected upward like wings. The purpose of the wings was psychological. When a formation of hussars charged, the wind rushing through the feathers created a whistling, screaming sound that terrified enemy horses and soldiers alike. It was biological warfare through acoustics. But the hussars were more than theater. They were the result of 2 centuries of Polish military evolution, specifically designed to fight both Western heavy cavalry and Eastern horse archers. They were fast enough to catch Tatar raiders and strong enough to smash through Ottoman janissaries. They were the perfect hybrid weapon. But Sobieski knew 18,000 men weren't enough. He needed allies. He reached out to the German princes, to the Duke of Lorraine, to anyone who would listen. Slowly, reluctantly, a coalition formed. Charles of Lorraine brought imperial troops. The Bavarians sent regiments. The Saxons marched. By the time they all converged on the Danube in early September, the relief army numbered around 70,000 men. It was impressive, but it was also a logistical nightmare. These weren't unified forces. They were separate armies with separate commanders, separate supply lines, and separate egos. Holding them together required diplomacy as much as military skill. The question arose immediately: who commands? Sobieski was a king, but he was also technically the outsider. Charles of Lorraine was a Habsburg duke with a claim to seniority. The German princes each thought they should lead. It could have devolved into a paralyzed committee, but Sobieski solved it with a single gesture. At the war council held on the banks of the Danube, he stood up and acknowledged Charles of Lorraine's experience. He offered to serve under Charles in the initial approach. It was a masterstroke of humility. By deferring publicly, Sobieski won the trust of the coalition and secured their cooperation. But everyone in that tent knew the truth. When the real fighting started, when the cavalry had to charge, there was only one man who could lead that charge. The winged hussars answered to Sobieski alone. The relief army began its march toward Vienna on September 9th. They had to move fast. The latest intelligence from the city was grim. The walls were crumbling. The garrison was down to its last reserves of gunpowder. Von Starhemberg had sent a final message. If you don't arrive by September 12th, you'll arrive too late. The Ottomans will be inside the city. Sobieski pushed his men hard. They marched through the Vienna woods, a dense forested mountain range that loomed over the besieged city. It was risky terrain. If the Ottomans had posted a strong force in the woods, they could have ambushed the relief column and ended the campaign before it started. But Kara Mustafa made a critical error. He was so focused on breaking into Vienna that he ignored the scouts who warned him that a massive Skirchin army was approaching from the northwest. He assumed his light cavalry patrols could delay any relief force long enough for him to take the city. He was wrong. On the night of September 11th, the relief army crested the heights of Kahlenberg Mountain. From that vantage point, they could see everything. Vienna lay below them like a wounded animal surrounded by wolves. The Ottoman camp sprawled in every direction, a city of tents with cook fires twinkling like stars. They could see the siege trenches snaking toward the walls. They could see the breaches in the fortifications. They could see how close the Turks were to victory. The sight filled them with dread and determination in equal measure. Sobieski gathered his commanders and laid out the battle plan. It was simple, brutal, and relied entirely on speed and shock. The infantry would advance down the slopes first, engaging the Ottoman forces and pinning them in place. Then, once the enemy was committed, the cavalry would charge. 18,000 horsemen, the largest mounted assault in history, would pour down the mountain like an avalanche and smash into the Ottoman flank. It was a plan with no subtlety and no backup. If the charge failed, the relief army would be shattered and Vienna would fall. If it succeeded, they might just break the back of the Ottoman invasion. There was no middle ground. Inside Vienna, the defenders had no idea rescue was so close. They were fighting for every inch. On the morning of September 12th, the Ottomans launched what they believed would be the final assault. They had blown a massive breach in the walls near the Berg Bastion. Janissaries poured through the gap, fighting hand-to-hand with the exhausted garrison in the rubble. It was house-to-house combat. Von Starhemberg himself grabbed a musket and fought in the streets. The situation was so desperate that women and children were carrying stones to plug gaps in the walls. The city was on the verge of collapse. But outside, on the slopes of Kahlenberg, the relief army was descending. The battle began at dawn with the Imperial infantry advancing through the Vienna woods. They clashed with the Ottoman forward positions in a series of brutal skirmishes. The Turks fought back fiercely. They had numerical superiority and they knew the ground. But the Christians kept coming, wave after wave, pushing the Ottomans back toward their main camp. Kara Mustafa, hearing the commotion, finally realized the scale of what was happening. A massive relief army was on top of him. He had two choices: abandon the siege and turn to face this new threat, or gamble that he could take Vienna before the relief force could intervene. He chose the gamble. He ordered the assault on the city to continue while simultaneously pulling troops from the siege lines to face the approaching Christians. It was a disaster of command. He split his forces, weakening both efforts. The troops assaulting Vienna were now undermanned. The troops facing Sobieski were disorganized, pulled from their positions in a panic. By early afternoon, the Christian infantry had fought their way to the open ground south of the city. They formed up in battle lines, but they were exhausted and bloodied. The Ottomans, despite their confusion, still massively outnumbered them. It looked like a stalemate. Then the ground began to shake. At the top of Kahlenberg, King Jan Sobieski sat on his war horse, watching the battle unfold below. He had been patient. He had let the infantry do the hard work of engaging the enemy. Now the moment had arrived. He turned to his winged hussars, resplendent in their feathered armor, and raised his saber. The signal rippled down the line. 18,000 cavalrymen, Polish hussars, Austrian cuirassiers, and German heavy cavalry began to move. They didn't trot. They didn't canter. They went immediately into a gallop. Picture the scene. You're an Ottoman soldier, exhausted from 2 months of siege work, now scrambling to face this new Christian army that appeared out of nowhere. You've been fighting the Imperial infantry all morning. You're thirsty. You're confused. Your commanders are shouting contradictory orders. Then you hear it. A sound like distant thunder rolling down from the mountain. You turn and look up. The entire ridgeline has come alive. It's not trees. It's horses. Thousands of them. And they're coming straight at you, accelerating with every second, gaining speed from the slope. The wings on the hussars' backs are screaming in the wind. It sounds like demons. It sounds like the end of the world. The physics of a downhill cavalry charge are simple and terrifying. Gravity is a force multiplier. When a horse gallops downhill, it doesn't just run faster, it becomes heavier. The impact force increases exponentially. A knight on flat ground hits with a momentum of maybe 800 pounds at 15 miles per hour. A knight charging downhill hits with over 1,000 pounds at 25 miles per hour. It's the difference between being hit by a car and being hit by a truck. Multiply that by 18,000 horses, and you have a kinetic weapon that no infantry formation in history could withstand. The Ottoman lines didn't break. They vaporized. The first wave of hussars hit the Turkish positions like a meteor strike. Horses trampled men into the dirt. Lances punched through shields and bodies. The Ottomans tried to form defensive squares, but the speed of the charge gave them no time. The Christian cavalry didn't slow down. They punched through the first line, then the second, then the third. They were a spear of iron and horseflesh, driving straight toward the heart of the Ottoman camp.